You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Todd Litman, Executive Director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute. Todd discusses his book, New Mobilities, Smart Planning for Emerging Transportation Technologies. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting each month. We really appreciate it. We recently posted bonus materials with Zabe Ben talking about food, time travel, and the idea of home. If you're a Patreon supporter, head on over and get access to extra discussions with Laura Schul, Chuck Wolf, Carol Martins, and more. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, give $2 a month and you'll get some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month and you'll get my bus-only scarf. Winter will be here soon, and you'll need something transit-related to keep you warm, so get them while you can. Thanks to everyone that supports the show through Patreon and listening each week. We super appreciate it. And for a free trial of our 15-year-old Daily Cities newsletter, or for access to our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning and Practice, go to theoverheadwire.com. Our newsletter is the oldest and the best in the business because we share information about what everyone else is doing. So check it out if you get a chance, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Todd Litman, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Jeffrey.
Well, it's good to chat with you. We've kind of crossed paths before, and we were talking before the show how we kind of have chatted probably somewhere at a TRB or a conference or something, but never really got to sit down and chat. So it's nice to finally get to do that. Appreciate you sitting down with me and talking about your book. But before we get started, for those that might not know about who you are and what you do, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Executive Director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, which is my small independent research organization that is a platform for me to explore all kinds of emerging planning issues. I love research. I love investigating things where I'm not quite sure how it's going to come out, what the results are going to be. So I work on all kinds of different subjects, from affordable housing to sustainable transportation. I've been doing this for almost 30 years. I've been able to support a family as a consultant. I feel very lucky that I've been able to have a career that involves interesting and important issues. And most recently, I've gotten involved exploring some of the emerging transportation technologies and services. I started off looking specifically at autonomous vehicles and developing some predictions of how soon you and I can fire our chauffeur and depend on a robot to drive us around. And of course, that quickly expanded to include some of the other interesting emerging modes, things like air taxis, so little flying cars, and hyperloops, that is pneumatic tube transport, and of course, some mundane things, or some less glamorous things, I should say. Things like e-bikes and e-scooters, what we call micro-mobility, and telework, the role that telecommunications and delivery services can substitute for physical travel. And then some of the important but often overlooked emerging issues like how to manage freight transport more efficiently, logistics management, we call it, or how to integrate some of these emerging modes into what we call mobility as a service, MaaS. So that got me interested in looking and comparing these emerging issues. And I've spent the last year exploring those issues and writing a book about it.
Is it MaaS or MaaS? I honestly don't know. It's like data or data, right? It's one of those things, right?
I'm happy, whatever you want to call it.
Well, let's go back to VTPI and where that started, because, I mean, as long as I've been doing this, almost 20 years or so, researching urban issues and doing things related to cities and transportation, you've been writing and producing materials for folks to understand through your encyclopedias of information. I'm wondering how that got started and where you kind of got interested in cities.
Sure. Well, that's a great question. I was a bicycle activist in my younger days.
Not anymore?
I have continued, but I started off as a bicycle activist in a small city, Olympia, Washington, which happens to be a capital city. So after a few years of working at the local level, it just so happened what was then the League of American Wheelmen, the National Bicycling Association, asked me to be a state lobbyist. And that got me interested in sort of the bigger policy questions, how you explain to, say, a state policymaker or somebody high-level person at the Department of Transportation that bicycling deserved as much respect as other modes. And at the time, that was a pretty radical thought. So I got interested in how you frame the question, how you and communicate that issue. So I already had an undergraduate degree, a liberal arts degree, and I went back and got a master's degree. Technically, the degree is in environmental studies, but my real interest was looking at the economics and the policy issues related to what we would now call sustainable transportation. So I started off focusing on bicycling, but that quickly expanded, looking at questions related to how do you measure the benefits to users in the community of people driving less and relying more on walking and bicycling and public transit and telework. And so my master's thesis was developing a comprehensive cost framework for all these various modes under various conditions. So I developed an estimate of the full costs of, for example, somebody driving under urban peak, urban off-peak, and rural conditions, and what would be the savings, including savings to them, infrastructure, road and parking facility cost savings, safety benefits, health benefits, environmental benefits, et cetera, if people were to drive less and rely more on what you call the sustainable or green or resource efficient modes. So that was my master's thesis. And even before I completed it, I was starting to get consulting contracts to apply this framework and to help various professional organizations and government agencies and environmental organizations frame the questions in that way. Use this cost model to calculate costs and benefits. So I hung out a shingle. I established UTPI as a consulting firm, and I'm actually quite passionate about sharing information. I love to take the research that I've done and make it available. And this was all early during the history of the internet. I established our website and started posting my master's thesis, but also a lot of other research work on there. And amazingly, you could call it karma. I would do research on a subject, I would call it unfunded research, something that I'm interested in, and then post it on our website or publish articles or papers about it. And sometimes that led to a consulting contract. So it justified me doing all that unfunded research and sharing that information. That's been my business model, and miraculously, it seems to work.
Well, I appreciate it. I mean, I love the idea that you can share information and people can pick it up. I mean, you know what I do. I mean, I try to share as much information as possible with folks through the podcast, through the newsletter, et cetera. And then before that, at Reconnecting America, when I was there, we tried to share as much information on our website as possible and making a TOD database and all that stuff. And I find sometimes it's frustrating when there are organizations or some that don't share some of their information. They kind of hide it away or try to keep it for themselves. Do you ever find that that's frustrating? You're sharing all of your work and everything that you do, and then others are kind of keeping it secret from the world?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's really a crime against humanity if there is useful information that is unavailable to the people who could apply it and make the world a better place. And some of it is some organizations are restricting their release of information, thinking that they can cash in on it, that they can, make it profitable. Although my experience is that it's difficult to do. It's difficult to charge people for example, a report. But sometimes it's just, you could say, laziness or on various organizations' part, that they have some information. And if you know how to search, you might be able to find it on their website. But I find it often very difficult to access information. So, which is one of the roles that I play, is that if I spend an afternoon tracking down bits of information that are available but hard to access. So for example, just this morning, I was spending time trying to determine the various ways to measure non-automobile mode share. That is the portion of trips and the portion of people, portion of travelers who rely on walking, bicycling, public transit, and ride hailing or taxis. So I developed some estimates of those and a range of estimates because I look at commute mode share, which tends to undercount active transportation, and total trip share. And then I also include estimates of some of the mode share targets that some jurisdictions have developed. So a number of cities and states basically say we want to increase, in a lot of cases, double the amount of walking and bicycling and public transit that's occurring to achieve health benefits and reduce traffic congestion and reduce emissions. So that's one of the indicators that I use that I've developed, asking how can we determine what is a fair share of public resources to invest in these non-automotive modes? Are we underinvesting in walking and bicycling and public transit relative to the demand or our targets for those modes? And so anyway, I spent the morning collecting this information, putting together a beautiful graph. And now I'm looking forward to sharing that because it's this wonderful bit of information that helps frame one of the key questions that's come up frequently. That is, what is the fair share of money or road space that a jurisdiction should invest in walking and bicycling and public transit facilities?
Well, I like how in the book you reframe that a little bit. You document that usually around $800 a year or so are spent on roadways through federal spending, federal and local spending per capita. And then in there you make some, calculations and adjustments and say, well, it might look like a small increase, but on a per capita basis, and you're spending money this way, you can actually get a big benefit compared to that $800 we're spending per capita on roadways. And it's an interesting reframing of we're spending a little bit amount of money on this and it gets a little bit of return, but it actually, if you look at it per capita and if you look at it in a certain way, you get a large return. And so I like the way that you kind of turned that around and made it seem more important, which I think it actually is, but I think we don't display that very often or very well for the most part.
Exactly. So this is a very, let's say, fertile area of research for anybody who's interested in sustainable transportation, because for the last 100 years, our transportation planning has really been oriented toward accommodating automobile travel. In one of my recent studies titled Not So Fast, I look at the way planning is biased in favor of faster modes, faster and more expensive and resource-intensive modes like automobile travel and air travel, to the detriment of slower but more affordable and resource-efficient modes like walking and bicycling and public transit. As a result, we're favoring sprawled development over compact infill. So I've been very interested. You could frame it in terms of, our planning is automobile dependent or automobile oriented and leads to automobile dependent transportation system. You can frame it in terms of social equity. So somebody who, for any reason, cannot or should not or prefers not to drive for a particular trip are not getting their fair share. Or you can frame it in terms of, like you say, return on investment. It turns out that in most communities, a typical community is spending somewhere around $20, $25 annual per capita on sidewalks. And if it's a city that's making major investments in bicycle facilities, that's typically $20 to $40 a year per capita on bicycle facilities. And a typical community is spending somewhere between $100 and $200 a year in total to subsidize public transit. And people in that community are spending, as you mentioned, well, the households are spending somewhere around $5,000 a year per car to own and operate a car. And they're spending about $1,000, somewhere between $800 and $1,000 a year in total on roadway facilities. And probably, although it's highly variable and a little difficult to calculate, but somewhere between $2,000 and $4,000 on subsidized off-street parking, government mandated off-street parking. So you sum that together and you're talking many thousands of dollars per year, per capita, to lead an automobile-dependent lifestyle. And we know that there's latent demand, that many people would prefer to drive less and rely more on walking and bicycling and public transit if we made more investments. So some of my current research is exploring that, and my conclusions suggest that there's a very good positive return on investment if we were to take a small portion of the money that communities are investing in roads and parking facilities and that consumers are spending on their cars and reinvest it to improve non-automotive modes, that virtually everybody is better off overall. So the analysis that I'm doing, and some of which is discussed in my book, The New Mobilities, the analysis that I'm doing, I think, does build a pretty strong case that most North American communities have far more automobile ownership and far more automobile travel than what people would choose if we were willing to respond to that latent demand.
That's another thing in the book. I mean, you had a survey and it says what people are concerned about. And the thing that people are concerned about most is the price of travel out of all of the things they could possibly be concerned of. And so we're always talking in the media about congestion and those types of policies, but people are more concerned with the price of travel. And yet you just, said all of those subsidies and all of the spending that we do on parking, on road building, on insurance, and et cetera, what people have to pay to keep their cars up. And then the minuscule amounts that we pay for sidewalks and transit and cycling. And yet people want to save money. And I think most people don't want to get rid of their money. They hate taxes. They don't want to pay extra, but it's like it's hidden from them, or they don't quite understand the amount of money that's leaving their wallet maybe every year.
Exactly. The big challenge is that the spending on roads and parking facilities is pre-programmed. From your perspective as a consumer, you feel like you're being tapped, you're being required to spend money on roads and parking, regardless of whether or not you drive. And so from that perspective, if those are fixed sunk costs, you feel like, hey, I might as well get a car so I can get my money's worth from that expensive garage or parking space at my house. Some of the interesting experiments are when in a particular location, say a job site or an apartment building or something like that, they go from parking being free to parking being either cashed out or unbundled. So cashed out means that people who don't drive, so if you get to work by walking or bicycling or car sharing or public transit, that you get the cash equivalent of the parking subsidies that go to your workmates who drive. And parking unbundling means that if you rent an apartment, you're no longer required to pay for a parking space, that the parking is rented separately. So instead of paying $2,000 a month for an apartment that comes with a parking space, you would pay $800 or $1,800 a month for the apartment, but $200 a month for each parking space you want. So if you're a car-free household, you're no longer forced to pay for that parking space that would sit empty. And so the experience indicates that when an employer cashes out the free parking or apartment building unbundles the parking, that you get somewhere between a 10 and 30% reduction in car travel or automobile ownership, that typically 20% of car traffic is the result of this current practice of providing free parking to employees. And so we're increasing our traffic congestion and our traffic accidents and our air pollution and consumer costs overall, because we say, yeah, we'll give you this very valuable subsidy. It's worth, say, between $100 and $200 a month to drive. But if you use the other modes, we give you nothing. So those are the kind of experiments or case studies that we have now that demonstrate that you could call it latent demand for not driving. That some people will give up driving, will drive less if they're given more incentives, more better walking, bicycling, public transit, better financial incentives. And so this guides us to identify the transportation demand management strategies, the smart, effective ways to reduce traffic problems simply by correcting some of the existing market distortions that result in economically excessive automobile travel and sprawl.
So the book is New Mobilities, Smart Planning for Emerging Transportation Technologies. How did you decide on the specific mobilities that you were going to talk about in the book?
Right. Well, let's just say I picked them out of the air. They're all, from your perspective, Jeffrey, I'm sure you get press releases and emails and inquiries about all these emerging technologies and services all the time, right? And legitimately, there's excitement about them. I mean, most of us grew up with the Jetsons and Star Trek and all these predictions. When I was 5 years old, I went to the 1964 World's Fair, where there was this great exhibition by General Electric. It predicted the future as exciting and beautiful. We were all going to have jetpacks and fly to the moon. And some of this actually has come true. And, some of these predicted technologies really do improve our lives in various ways. I mean, the best example is the little flip phone that they had on Star Trek, which actually is kind of similar to the first generation of mobile phones. Although, if you watch Star Trek, you don't see them staring, checking their emails and Twitter feeds all the time. They're not being distracted. They only use that little mobile phone, their communicator, for urgent, important business. On Star Trek, they didn't display the downside of everybody walking around with way too much connectivity and information in their pocket that is a constant distraction. No, they didn't show that. So, which leads me into what this book is about. There's all these optimistic predictions, often by people with financial interest in the industry, that are promoting things like autonomous cars and air taxis and pneumatic tube transport and supersonic jets. And they're predicting this exciting new world. They show architectural renderings or illustrations where everybody in the autonomous car or in the Hyperloop capsule are happy, and they're all clean and tidy and shiny. And, it's kind of fun to inquire, to explore the question, what's it really going to be like? What would it really be like to get into the Hyperloop capsule, where you're going to be locked in to this little capsule with a couple dozen other people? You're strapped to your seat because it accelerates and then decelerates at a speed with forces that will make some people uncomfortable and nauseous. And you'll be stuck in there for somewhere between half an hour and an hour, depending on how far you're going. And if there's a crying baby next to you, or you suddenly need to use a washroom or something like that, there won't be any services on board. What's it really going to be like to get into an autonomous taxi after, you're, let's say, the 10th passenger for the morning and it hasn't been cleaned? Is it going to have some garbage and stains and suspicious odors? Those are the kind of questions that I think we should be asking now. So I did a review of all these technologies and services that are emerging, and I came up with a dozen that I think are kind of the most likely and the most interesting and worth exploring.
You kind of put it together like a Consumer Reports or a CNET for looking up your next computer. What was the choice of format, and how did that impact kind of how you wrote the book?
Sure. Well, that's what my concept was, to say, if you're purchasing a vehicle, there's all kinds of reports and websites and services that will help you choose the model or the type that's going to best suit your needs. If you're a policymaker or a planner and you're trying to choose which of the emerging transportation technologies and services are going to be best for you and your community, then you don't really have much objective, comprehensive information. There are a few reports on some of the individual mobilities, but as far as I have found, nobody has done a comprehensive comparison that explores the full impacts, the impacts on users and impacts on communities of these different emerging transportation modes and technologies or services, and therefore helps answer the questions about the planning questions. To what degree should we encourage or accommodate or regulate or restrict and maybe even forbid some of these under certain circumstances?
And when you started the book, obviously you and I have biases and our, ideas of where we think things should go. What were your transportation values when you set out to write the book? And after you finished, did you find any changes in how you saw things?
Well, I like to think that I am a good planner. And so my mission, my intent was not to apply my own values, but really to provide the information so decision makers, including policymakers and practitioners, professional planners and engineers and economists, and also the general public, can make informed decisions. So my intent is not to tell people what to do or tell policymakers what to do. It's to provide a basic analysis framework so that the readers, the users of the framework, can develop their own or apply their own values and make their own decisions. And I'm doing my best to provide objective, comprehensive information. As you've probably seen in the book, there are pages and pages of references at the end of endnotes. I try and provide the information so that if you are interested in any of the specific issues that are presented in the book, so for example, you want to find out more about what are the estimated costs of autonomous vehicles, or what will be the safety profile of air taxis and delivery drones, things like that. There has been research looking at those specific questions. And if you're interested, then you could use the references in the book. But you could say by developing a comprehensive framework, I'm identifying the types of information that decision makers are probably going to want to have when they're making these assessments of specific new emerging mobilities and how they should be applied in their specific community.
And that's something you say in the book, is that you make very clear that people can attach their values or their scores to any of the kind of scoring systems that you've put together and come up with their own ideas. And it's not necessarily the ones that you share that are the ones that are going to come out the way that it comes out maybe in the book. So I appreciate that. I do wonder, however, if a senator who had just voted for this infrastructure bill in the United States, if they would have sat down and read this, what they maybe would have funded if they would have actually sat down and looked through the book and kind of came up with a system rather than just kind of funneling money to the places where they wanted to funnel money already.
Right. So since you've read the book, you have probably seen one of my conclusions is that the affordable, healthy, resource-efficient modes really deserve the priority over the expensive, resource-intensive modes. And so a smart community, whether that's your local, city or town, or your state government or a country, whatever scale of planning you're talking about, that if they're smart, they're going to give priority to the better mode, to the ones that are affordable, inclusive, healthy, resource efficient, and invest less. But for the last 100 years, we've had it backwards. We've said speed is our priority. Faster is better. Reducing traffic congestion delays are our primary goal. And that set into motion a whole host of planning decisions that I believe are inefficient and not responsive to consumer demands.
There were so many fantastic predictions about transportations in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. The hoverboards and all that stuff come to mind. Back to the Future was the movie that I always think of in terms of, what the prognosticators thought maybe would be an idea. I've definitely seen also what you're talking about in Star Trek. What happened to those modes? What happened to those kind of space age ideas that sometimes came out in these new mobilities? I mean, pneumatic tubes are something that people have kind of dreamed about, but what happened and why were they kind of either short shrift in getting investments, or why did the automobile continue as an inertia idea?
Well, yes, I'm still waiting for my jetpack. I was promised a jetpack when I was young. They predicted that by the 21st century, we would all be traveling on jetpacks. Jeffrey, what century are we in?
The 50th, right? The 21st.
The 21st century has come. It was the future, and it's come. Now, to be fair, the transition from, say, 1900, where transportation primarily meant walking, with a little bit of bicycling and a little bit of rail transport, but primarily people, on a day-to-day basis, most people walked primarily. And then the advent of bicycles, and bicycles became affordable, and then public transit improved. So you had urban trolleys all over the place, and then automobiles. There's no question there are very significant benefits to users, but we locked into place policies that privilege automobile travel over the more affordable and resource efficient modes, and that spoils the system. As an example, the second chapter in my book was really a fun one to research. I went back and looked at the economic history of our previous transportation innovations, particularly motorization. And what I found is that from 1900 to the year 2000, so over the 20th century, our mobility, our travel speed, and therefore the distance that people can travel in their travel time budget increased by an order of magnitude. We went from the average person traveling about 1,000 miles, maybe a little bit more per year, to the average person traveling about 10,000 miles a year. And that sounds great. We have expanded our world. Our world got bigger. On the other hand, it also increased the cost to individuals and to communities by an order of magnitude. So in 1900, there's this great household expenditure survey that I uncovered from 1901 by the US Department of Commerce at the time. And they asked working man's families how they spent their dollars. And it turned out transportation was such a small cost category, it wasn't even in the survey. It just was included with miscellaneous. The average household in 1900, the average working man's family spent almost nothing on transportation. By the year 2000, a working class family devotes about 20% of its household budget to vehicles, including the residential parking for that vehicle. So the cost of your garage or off-street parking. Put them together and you're spending 20%, 1/5 of your household budget on transportation, which means 1/5 of your workday is devoted to paying for your vehicles for an average car-owning worker. Which means if you measure travel speeds, based what we call effective speed. So it's your travel distance divided by the time you're spending traveling plus the time you're spending earning money for your travel expenses, the average working class motorist is actually not traveling that fast. And especially low-income people are spending more time earning money for their cars than they are spending driving that car. And for many working class people, they are better off. They are traveling faster by bicycling and public transit than they are taking all that time to earn money so they can afford a car, so they can commute to work, so they can earn more money. The level of automobile ownership and use that we have in North America is what you could call an economic trap. It's a situation where people are encouraged or forced to consume more and spend more than they really would prefer, more than they would choose if they had better options. So there are a whole bunch of people, I think, in North America, especially lower income, working class people, who would be better off if we had much better, affordable travel options, or even better to describe it as better accessibility options, which means better walking, bicycling, and public transit, and better housing options in those walkable, transit-rich areas. So any household, particularly those with low incomes, could find suitable housing in the affordable transportation neighborhoods. What do you think, Jeffrey? Do you think there are a lot of people who would prefer to drive less and rely more on walking and bicycling and public transit, provided those are excellent quality services?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we talk about that all the time on the show. how if given the chance, people would do that. I mean, you see this all the time when people are given the opportunity to live in maybe a place that's different from their suburban life. My parents moved from a suburb of Houston to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and we talked about this with Chris and Melissa Bruntlett, who were on the show a couple of weeks ago. And I think it was eye-opening for them to a certain extent. You know, my mom grew up in San Francisco, and she, lived here originally, but and they understood BART and taking transit and stuff in the Bay Area, but they were living in a suburb at the time, and then they moved to Rotterdam, and they lived in downtown. They didn't have a car. They were able to get to many parts of the country and even Europe through trains. They were able to walk to the stores. My mom went to the market almost every day. And so I think that changes your perspective on things. If you're given that opportunity to do that, even when people go traveling, even if it's in the United States, they go to a New York or Chicago for a conference or something along those lines, you get that kind of reorientation of what things could be like. And so I think if given the opportunity, people would probably reduce their travel through, single occupancy vehicles. But in the United States, as you know, and North America for that matter, and Canada, in a lot of places that opportunity doesn't exist. And so people can't live that lifestyle. So the expenditures that we make are stuck in that inertia of auto ownership. And, you know this, I know this. I think a lot of the listeners know this, but it's good to repeat, I think, when thinking about how our investments change things. And which is why, the new bill that just passed is frustrating, I think, for a lot of folks here in the US who hoped that maybe we could start to make it, a different investment paradigm than we had been making over the last 100 years. I don't think people really understand what $1 trillion actually does. And, it's something that maybe if we were able to explain it better, it would have gone a different direction. Or maybe if the senators were, from urban places, they might have understood it better. But this is what we're getting so far, and hopefully we can make some changes. But, it goes the way it goes, I guess.
Right. So that's very consistent with the research of my whole career, is that I think that many people would choose to rely less on automobiles and more on resource efficient and affordable alternatives if we were investing in them comparable to the spending that we devote to automobile transportation. By the way, I think for planners, the best way to clarify a lot of these things, for most comparisons, it's best to convert things into per capita annual. So you could ask, if the $1 trillion is going to be over, say, a 5-year period, and you would ask, what does that represent for the average American each year? And then they're able to compare that in their minds, what that investment, how it compares with, say, what they're spending on their car or what their community is spending on roads and parking facilities. So that's what I recommend. Usually when we're doing economic analysis, I try and convert most of these impacts, costs and benefits.
See, the problem is that I just tried to calculate it, and my phone calculator only goes to 100 million. I can't even get to a trillion to do the calculation.
Okay, so the key trick is that there's currently about 1/3 of a billion United Statesians.
Right, 330 million or so people that live in the U.S.
Exactly. So what you do is you convert a trillion into,
sure,
what is it, 1,000 billions, and then divide that by 0.33, and you've got a rough estimate of what it works out to be. But in any case, this is exactly the issue. So these issues are confronting us frequently. Questions like, what parking requirements should be imposed by your local government? Or how much should, say, the State Department of Transportation spend on active transportation? Or how much should local, state, and federal governments invest in public transportation? Those are very important questions. And then we ask, how do the new mobilities, how do these exciting emerging transportation technologies and services change our conclusions? And my main conclusion is they don't do it too much. That the optimistic predictions that say electric autonomous vehicles are going to solve our traffic congestion and parking and air pollution problems, or that air taxis will allow most commuters to avoid traffic congestion, those are really not realistic. These emerging modes may eventually have some role to play in an efficient and equitable transportation system, but the new technologies do not fundamentally change what you call the geometry of our transportation system. An automobile, whether it's human-driven or autonomous, robot-driven, whether it's a big car or a small car, takes up an order of magnitude more space than a bicycle, and 2 orders of magnitude more space than a passenger in a bus or a train during peak periods. Even autonomous cars will probably need parking spaces, off-street parking. At least they'll need a lot of curb space for dropping off and picking up passengers. And you don't want those autonomous cars to simply be circling the block for hours on end while you're shopping or at work. So you still need an off-street parking space for those autonomous cars. So the basic design factors are not going to change fundamentally with electric or autonomous cars, or I don't think it's realistic to expect air taxis, flying little self-operated helicopters, to significantly reduce traffic congestion. So we end up with the basic principle that efficiency requires that we give priority to the space-efficient modes, that is walking, bicycling, ride sharing, and public transit under urban conditions, under congested conditions, and that we charge users for the infrastructure and the external costs that they impose. So we're discouraging people from using dangerous, polluting, space-intensive travel options. Those principles are going to apply equally to the new mobilities, to the new technologies, as they do to the current technologies. Our big challenge right now is to get those principles applied. Very few jurisdictions, especially in North America, are applying any sort of efficient road and parking pricing. And there are a number of other, and we're underpricing fuel. The taxes on gasoline and diesel are much lower than, for example, what would be required just to pay for roadway infrastructure. And so our current policies are inefficient, and you introduce new transportation technologies. And my conclusion is, with current policies, we're only going to make the problems worse. We're going to have worse traffic congestion, and we're going to have little or no reduction in traffic accidents measured per capita. And we're going to have more sprawl, and non-drivers, low-income non-drivers are going to be worse off. So So it's time to take the lessons that we've learned over the last century and start applying them as we plan for new technologies and services.
Well, I don't want to end on the negative part, so give me some optimism. Give me
Absolutely.
some optimism.
The solutions are there. We have the potential of creating better lifestyles for ourselves and far better communities, and the new technologies can play a role. For example, the best exciting innovation right now are e-bikes and e-scooters, what we call micro modes. In the past, we could reasonably say that somewhere around 10% of urban trips are currently made by walking and bicycling, 10 to 15%. And we could, set targets to increase that, increase the amount of travel. In the past, we called that smart growth or new urbanism or location efficient development. Now we call it the 15-minute city or the 15-minute neighborhood. And we're emphasizing that that if we do good planning, an increasing portion of our accessibility needs could be met within our neighborhood by walking and bicycling. With e-bikes, you can easily double that. So if our target was to increase walking and bicycling from, say, 10% to 20%, which is a perfectly reasonable target, with e-bikes and e-scooters, you could raise that to 30%. So it is perfectly reasonable to say that a third of our travel in a typical North American community could be met by walking, bicycling, and e-bikes. That is a huge, huge savings to consumers. If a household can go from owning 2 cars to 1 car plus 2 e-bikes or e-scooters, that household is going to save somewhere around $5,000 a year that they can spend on all kinds of great local stuff. And the household members are going to be exercising a little bit more. Most of the e-bikes, they're electric assist bikes. They still require some pedaling. You're requiring far cheaper infrastructure. Your road and parking costs plummeted. You've cut car ownership in half, and they are really fun. E-scooters and e-bikes leave people with a smile on their face. I mean, the truth is, for truth in advertising, car commercials should always show the passengers in those snazzy new cars looking bored and overweight and impoverished. Because the truth is, owning a car is not very fun, and it's not very healthy, and it is extremely expensive. So if we are smart, we will do everything we can to improve and encourage walking and bicycling and micromodes. Similarly, there's a whole bunch we can do to make public transit more convenient and comfortable. Simple things like having an integrated app that allows you to quickly navigate your transportation system and pay, RFID payment system, so you never have to worry about finding and recharging your payment card or buying a ticket. The buses could be much nicer with little fold-down work tables so you can get out your notebook computer and get some work done with onboard Wi-Fi service. And why is it that buses don't have cup holders? I mean, when people are shopping around for a car, the most important thing that the car salespeople tell us is the first thing they look for is, what are the cup holders serving the drivers? And that's what people really care about. We could have cup holders and fold-down work table and other conveniences on your bus. So riding your bus to work is actually one of the high points of your day. That is all very feasible and cost-effective compared with the full costs of accommodating more people driving to work. These new technologies and services could fill an awful lot of gaps. What do you think, Jeffrey? When the autonomous cars are available for sale, are you going to spend tens of thousands of dollars in additional costs for your self-driving car? Or are you going to get a really nice e-scooter and e-bicycle and spend your time and money walking and bicycling and e-biking in your neighborhood? What is the better lifestyle for you?
For me personally, I don't have a car and I have a bike already. I don't need any extra e-bikes or e-scooters. I don't need an autonomous vehicle either. I live in a very transit-oriented place in San Francisco, and I find that walking and biking and taking the bus gets me most places I want to go. It doesn't get me to the redwoods necessarily, but it does get me for the most part where I want to go. And that's easy to get a zip car or rent a car at the airport or something if I really need to. But I don't think I need actually an e-bike or an e-scooter. I do enjoy riding an e-scooter. I did in DC I think it was for TRB last time before the pandemic started. That was kind of fun. But for me personally, I think I don't know if I'm actually going to be spending any extra money. I think I'm good where I am, but I'm an anomaly here. I think.
Actually, I think you're normal. It's just you are lucky enough to live in a neighborhood where you can express those demands, where you have the feasibility of getting around using each mode for what it does best. So you can walk and bicycle, and when you grow old and need the assistance, use a electric assist bike for local errands. And then you can use public transit when you're traveling from one neighborhood to the other in your region. And you can rent a car, so car sharing and bike sharing are one of the categories recognized in my book. And you put them all together and you've got the efficient and equitable, affordable package. So, our goal should be to ensure that everybody has the opportunities that you and I have of being able to lead a car-free or car-light lifestyle. It's a far better lifestyle. And so I hope we can inspire planners and policymakers to put it all together so everybody has this wonderful opportunity to lead that multimodal lifestyle.
For sure. The book is New Mobilities, Smart Planning for Emerging Transportation Technologies. Where can folks find it if they want to get a copy?
Right. So it is available on the Island Press website. So just go to islandpress.com and search for the New Mobilities. And if you put Litman, all capitals, Litman, into the discount code, you get 20% off. You lucky readers. And if you did want, you could go to your local bookstore and they could order it for you. It's also from the Island Press website, you can get it in electronic formats. Or you could visit my website, Victoria Transport Policy Institute, vtpi.org. And there's a link from there to the ordering form on the Island Press website.
Awesome. And how can folks find you online if you wish to be found?
Visit vtpi.org or send me an email to litman@vtpi.org. And I enjoy continuing these conversations. You can also see my blogs on the Planet Isn't website. And in fact, I just posted one, a fun one, where I was recently asked, what's my favorite commute song? What do you think I chose, Jeffrey?
Riding on the Metro by Berlin.
Take the A Train by Duke Ellington.
Okay.
His band's signature song, because it's not about commuting to work. It's about traveling to Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance to enjoy some of the most spectacular music. It just makes me happy to listen to the beautiful teamwork of a big band performing this spectacular, exciting music. So Take the A Train is, to me, the epitome. To emphasize, it's all about taking a train. It's all about the excitement of taking a train. And you can hear in the rhythm of Duke Ellington's spectacular music, you can hear the many, many days that Duke and his orchestra spent traveling across North America by train. The rhythm is right there. It's an experience.
That's awesome. Well, Todd, thanks for joining us. We really, really appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Jeffrey. Thank you very much.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.